Awesome. Well, thank you for indulging me. I'm going to talk about some hopefully things that are useful. I'm going to give you 7 distinct tips that I use to try to keep everything going in my life when it comes to making content. So this idea of living in a content grinder, that's not necessarily the company I work for. That's just my life right now. So throughout my life, I am constantly asking this question that I know that you're asking as well, because I put myself in a situation where there's always a vacuum that I need to fill for content. What is the next thing going to be? How am I going to produce that? And I'm always in this mode of either editing, writing, reviewing, or looking at somebody else's stuff for inspiration. And so I'm always just trying to figure out what is the next thing. And I often don't know until like right before it's due, which is not a fun place to be. You just get really, really scared and anxious. And so what I've started to figure out over the past year or so is the times when I feel most successful creating things, what am I doing? What are the practices that I'm involved in? And then what does, looking back at stuff that maybe I went through and I released and I felt bad about it for some reason. Looking back at it months later or years later, what actually had staying power? Because maybe I was being too judgmental or too harsh on myself. And so I'm going to try to just extract things from that. I'll give you a couple examples where those are relevant, but I don't want it to be about me or anything that I've done. I want this to be about you and what you can do and what you can get right. So I say I wasn't going to make it about me, but Lance did ask for me to put an about me slide. So when it comes to content, these are some of the things you may or may not know me for. I did release 2 books on security awareness and culture and behavior. I have a podcast called 8th Layer Insights at KnowBe4. I'm also the executive director, or executive producer, I should say, for the Inside Man series. This won a bunch of awards, and then I present at a lot of conferences and write articles that are out there probably about once a week or so. Something out there that I've written, and so I am always in this mode of how do I come up with it, and that's the part where you are as well. I think, as you're thinking about your security awareness campaign, whether it is that next newsletter or it's a video that you need to put together or anything else, you're probably thinking, where do I come up with the idea? How do I put the right information in that? How do I make it relevant, entertaining, or whatever the right thing is that's going to actually get somebody to consume that content? So, and again, yeah, there we go. So one of the things, and this came to me last night as I was desperately trying to sleep, thinking about presenting today. There is in product development this thing called the iron triangle. You may have seen it before. You may have heard people talk about it before. And as I was going to bed last night, I was like, oh, there's actually a somewhat of a parallel, or at least an idea build that can happen here. And it is in the iron triangle, you can have 2 of these things. Something that you're producing, I should say, can either be good. It can either be good and fast, but it's not going to be cheap. It can be cheap and good, but it's not going to be fast. Or it can be fast and good, but you're going to pay a lot for it. So there's always these interactions that are going on. And the iron triangle is really a study in trade-offs. You can only have 2 of those things. Now, I think in content, there is something similar that is always going through my mind, and I only really formulated it again last night, but it really was able to put into words the things that I'm always juggling. And so when I think about content, you can either have, and I'm gonna have to look here because I am blind, you can either have excellent production. Actually, it's not either an or. You're always juggling production values. You're juggling the engagement level, and you're juggling relevance. So you can either have I keep saying either, even though I shouldn't. You have production, which can be excellent. You have the things that are going on in that make it relevant. And then you have the way that you engage. And this is an additive thing. And from my perspective, 2 of 3 is pretty much good enough to get somebody to engage with that content. 3 of 3 is better, right? You can have something that's produced really great, but if it doesn't feel relevant and it's not engaging in some way, it's just, you're going to change the channel. You're not going to engage with that. But if you have something that's produced great and has some kind of engagement with it, engaging content and engaging format, something going on with that, even if it doesn't feel relevant, it's going to capture your attention and keep that for a while. Now, you could also have something that is really engaging and relevant, but it's not produced that great. If it's engaging and relevant, you're probably still going to pay attention to it for a while. But if you start to break these things off, it's going to have way less of an impact on whoever you're trying to communicate to, because let's face it, this is all how we act. I would say that in the absence of any other information, if there's something extremely relevant and somebody needs it, relevance alone can do it. But that is not us giving content to people in our organization. That is somebody self-serving trying to find it. And the example for that is, a couple of years ago, my dryer broke at my house. I didn't want to spend or wait a long enough time for somebody to come repair it. And so I searched on YouTube and I found the crappiest, grainiest video of this guy that was uber confident at fixing dryers. And I watched that thing over and over and over. Thing is when it comes to that's self-serve, that's a pull model. And we do that as consumers. But if we're pushing content out to people and saying this is mandatory or this is optional, they're not going to engage with it the same way because they don't feel that deep need. And that's one of the things is anytime we're dealing with relevance, we always have to be thinking about what is the felt need that somebody has. What is and I think about this as realized need or felt need. Now, in lots of circumstances, when you hear a speaker talk about need, they'll talk about real or felt needs. Now, we all know that people have lots and lots and lots of real needs that they just are not interested in at the time. People, again, Oz was talking about this yesterday. People need to eat better. They need to lose weight. They need to save more money, all that kind of stuff. Those are real needs that feed us and make us healthier in lots of different ways. But many people don't feel that need. And so a realized need is a real need that has started to bubble up in the consciousness and become more felt. And so we're always dealing with these 3 things. And again, from my perspective, 2 of these 3 is pretty good. It's going to get your content consumed. And so again, that was just a kind of a thing that was going through my mind last night as I was trying to figure out, basically how I was going to sleep. And so I did put myself to sleep with that. So now when I'm thinking about content, for me, the scariest thing in the world, and this may be also the same for you, is the blinking cursor on a blank page. Because at that point, we don't know where to start. We don't know what's going on. We have no idea, or maybe we'd have an idea. Maybe it's somebody says, you need to write a newsletter about passwords, or you need to write a video about passwords. But then at that point, you're like, okay, maybe I can do a bullet pointed list about all the great things that you need to know about passwords and where the password manager is. But then how do I make somebody actually want to read it? Or how do I even get the idea of what is going to be most relevant for my people? And so that's what I'm hoping to help us all get past a little bit. So I'm going to go through 7 different things that have helped me over the past several years. And number 1 is this attitude that I developed, I think, out of desperation. And the attitude is that I can learn from everybody. I should be able to learn from anybody out there. If that person is, especially if that person is doing significantly better than I am in the way that they produce and the things that they're creating, I can learn from that person, even if I don't appreciate or like that person's content or genre or personality or anything else. I can learn from that person. And so something like Masterclass is a great example. I subscribe to that. I learned a lot about writing from Dan Brown. I hate his books. I learned a lot about production from people that I've never listened to their records. But these people are recognized masters in their industry, and they're constantly producing things. So they probably know something that I don't know yet. The other thing is that as they're talking about all that, and they're showing their things, our minds naturally start to make connections. Even if it doesn't feel relevant at the time, you'll be going through some, driving the next day, and you'll go, oh, you know what? I saw this, comedy thing from Steve Martin, now somebody I do like. Saw this comedy thing. He was talking about X, Y, and Z. And in my program, this seems like a totally unrelated thing, but now all of a sudden these ideas fuse together in a unique and interesting way that may just capture somebody's attention. If not, maybe it's enough to get me unstuck, where I can write the first few words of whatever that is. So learn from everybody, learn from all different types of genres, content types, and so on. The second one is, and I alluded to this a little bit, is we have to think about branches, trenches, and pivots in our content. And I'll explain what those are so that you actually have some context. For me, anytime I've already created something or there's a topic that I want to cover, your first immediate thought is, how do I vector into that? What is the associated idea that I can use? I mean, I can be really upfront and forward. If it's passwords, the first line in the video or the first line in the page be, people have lots of questions about passwords, but it might not be the most interesting, relevant, well-produced way to do it. If I'm doing a hacker movie, I might show the result of a data breach that's happened because somebody lost their password in another breach or had it hacked, and then now it's causing this cascading bit of failure. Or I can find an analogy where it has nothing to do with passwords, but it relates to kittens in some way. So you can find lots of different ways that you can tie things together. And in any of these, you're always thinking about, what are the branches, what are the trenches, and what are the pivots? Actually, let me go back for a second. So a branch is starting with one idea and then figuring out how I can extend that out. So moving from passwords to something that's a little bit related to that. It would be, well, password management, creating and remembering a good password, not just the topic, but let me figure out a nuance of that. A trench is very similar. It's going as deep into the weeds on one specific nuance as you can go. So a branch, think about that as a nuance, but then just a very general high level view of that so that somebody gets appreciation and maybe one or two tips. A trench is one of those branches, and I'm mixing metaphors here, one of those branches, but then you go really, really deep with it. So a piece of nuance, and then you uncover as much of that over and over and over as you can, and get as deep in the weeds as you need to with that. And then a pivot is starting with an idea and then hitting an adjacent idea off of that. And so these are things that you realize as you're having these little epiphanies, and as you watch other pieces of content or read other books, and you're like, oh, this idea relates to that. I could pivot off of that. I could use that as a vector, or this, sprung another idea in my mind simply because I was thinking about one thing, and then all of a sudden I get hit with another problem that seems totally unrelated, but it's actually a pivot point. So the other thing is, in all of this, is silence is our friend. These points of epiphany or serendipity that you're going to come to as you're thinking about branches or going deeper or how to pivot, these come generally in times when you're not filling your mind with something else. So the proverbial shower serendipity that people get. And well, it's because they don't have earphones in, most of us. They don't have something else coming in. It is just the white noise of the shower and their own thoughts. And all of a sudden, the mind starts to surface all of this stuff it's been chugging on for a long time. And so for us, I think we need to cultivate, if you're in a creative field and you're trying to create constantly, or even trying to get started, cultivate silence in some way. So use things like masterclass, use things like webinars, books, and so on. Fill your mind a lot with diverse pieces of content from a diverse and wide variety of people. And the other thing is then give yourself silence for your mind to start to surface things that are interesting and useful. And then the other thing is noise is also your friend, right? Because a lot of these ideas will only come to us as we're figuring out how we populate our mind. Because every bit of content that we read, everything that we consume becomes something that can then become a branch, a trench, or pivot, or something else that we utilize in an interesting way. And that's going to come in important in just a minute. So the other thing that I like to do is create artificial constraints for myself. So anybody that's listened to the Eighth Layer Insights podcast that I do, there were a few things that I really experimented with over the past season. One was, and I'll give an example of that in a minute. One was writing a series of scripts where I had several different personified security tools, like a piece of facial recognition software, actually, not even just tools. I did a secure email gateway. I also did, password, and then also a phishing email. But with each of those scripts, I said, for each of these, I'm going to basically set a timer. And at 45 minutes of that script, of writing that script for each person, I'm going to stop. And I'm not going to go back. I'm not going to do any corrections other than egregious stuff. And you can go hear the result of that. It's episode 16 or season 2, episode 6, however you count those things. And there's, from my perspective, there's obvious flaws, but from everybody else's perspective, and this has been listened by, by tens of thousands of people, nobody's ever surfaced those to me. And so then, as you're thinking about those constraints, it could be time, it could be a tool set, it could be, anything that you can find that's going to hamper you. Put that constraint on yourself and then see what happens. You generally work smarter and faster and get a lot more creativity as soon as you feel bounded, because it is the limitless freedom of exploring anything you want in any way that you want that causes paralysis, at least for me. And I think that that's probably shared among a lot of people. That's what scares us with that blinking cursor. Putting artificial bounds means you have to get started, or you have to start with a certain thread. Use other people's stuff and give them credit for it. So early in my career, in my own hubris, I thought that I had to create everything myself, that for me to be good at whatever I do, it all has to be, at least in my mind, something that I generate that's fully from my mind, fully formed, comes onto the page, and then people will gasp in awe. That's not the way the world works. The way the world works is that we all leverage each other's ideas, and we stand on the shoulders of giants. The content in my books and articles, stuff most people in this room already know, may have said from the stage, and somebody like me comes along and says, oh, you know what? I got this idea from Lance. I get this idea from Jessica Barker. I get this idea from Oz. And then what we do is we get on a stage like this, and if we're good about it, then we'll give credit to that person. I'll say, I really love Lance's philosophy and the way that he speaks about managing human risk. And so I may start a presentation like that, and then I'll give 30 minutes of presentation based on the how we view security awareness from the perspective of managing human risk. But if I did that you wouldn't all of a sudden not give me credit for the 30 minutes of content that I just gave you. You'd say, oh, wow, Perry's actually honest about where this idea germinated from. And then now he went and taught us something. So we have to get past ourselves. I have to get past myself a lot for feeling like I have to originate new stuff. No, there's tons of great stuff out there. We can serve as really interesting aggregation points for the stuff that has changed the way that we view the world and that we want to impart on other people. And so an example, I mentioned this already, which was the Security is Alive episode. There were two things. I was watching a masterclass from Margaret Atwood, and she was talking about writing and creating different points of view. And she said, all right, now write this thing from the point of view of a stapler. What would that be like? If a stapler was wanting to have an affair with a matchbox, how would that perspective be? How would they interact with each other? What would they think about? And so I listened to that, and then there was a podcast called Everything is Alive that is inanimate objects being interviewed. And I was like, well, crap, I could do that from a security perspective. And then so now there's these really weird, surreal, absurdist interviews that I have with a secure email gateway. And the email gateway lets me in to see everything that it sees, and it drives me mad. And also helps me understand, oh, yeah, that's why you don't catch everything, because there's so much all the time. And you want to do better, but you just can't. You're an email gateway. You can only be programmed to do a certain amount of things. And so there's this other human that needs to be able to account for that on the other side. So as you start to pivot around those things, you can come up with lots and lots of different ideas, and they're genuinely fun and consumable. Show your work is admit your own ignorance and leverage the process of learning. There's a new podcast that I'm working on. It's not out yet. It's just called My Podcast Journey. And it's me and somebody else that I hired in a private podcast company that I started a couple months ago. And it's us talking about the process of trying to learn how to do podcasting. And what it does is it gives us an opportunity to, number one, get a podcast out and get listenership and do all the fun things around monetization and everything else that you want to do if you're a company. But then the other thing is it actually serves the public. It serves people that want to do more, because it says, all right, here's Perry and Mason, who's my business partner in that. Let's see if they succeed or fail with this idea. Let's see what tools they use. Let's see how those sound. Let's see what they work like. Let's see how they're productive or not. And so we can throw ideas out, and we don't have to pretend like we're masters. People that pretend like they're masters generally come across as jerks. People that pretend like they're on a journey trying to figure themselves out become way more appealing and kind of welcome people in. And so that's the kind of people we should be. Even when we're saying, here's what you need to do with your passwords, you can say, here's the journey that I went on. I was dealing with all this stuff. I was reusing the same password over and over. I had an internal algorithm in my head. And then one day somebody showed me a password manager, and I was resistant to that at first. And I delayed doing it because of X, Y, and Z. So tell the story about it, but then you can show the process. And as you're going on a new journey, you can do the same thing, whether that's how you create content. I mean, this presentation is a little bit of a show your own work type of thing. And it's interesting to you because you see me on a journey trying to figure this out, and you're like, oh, I'm kind of on that same journey too. This is relevant to me. The other thing is I have to, because I'm so busy, I have to ruthlessly outsource the things that I'm not good at, and or the things that I don't want to learn or have the patience to learn. Everybody only has a certain amount of hours in the day. And for me at KnowBe4, content production, the stuff that I do is maybe 15% of my job. Everything else is stuff that I do in the margins for myself. And so I don't have a lot of time to do stuff that I don't have a passion around. And so that could be first level editing. That could be anything really, whether that's graphic design. I'm not a great graphic designer on my own, though I do do probably 98% of my own slides most of the time. But at the same time, if I want something great, I'm going to go spend money and have somebody that's poured their life into that one thing help me be more successful with whatever that is. And it's almost amazing how inexpensive most of this work can be when you're really kind of looking at the trade-off of your time and what you might be able to create versus what somebody else can help you do so that you further your own project. So the other thing is find tools that force you to think in new ways. I get really, again, if I open up Microsoft Word, I almost immediately get a mental block against it. What I found with another new show that I'm working on, this is going to be all about a different intersection between technology and humanity as I explore digital culture. And this one's fully, got a lot of additional scripting and sound design and everything else. I was trying to do that in Microsoft Word, and I was looking at the page for way too long. And then I ultimately just said, you know what, this is a script. Let me think about it like a screenwriter. And I downloaded screenwriter software. It's a little bit like an integrated development environment for those of you that are programmers. Downloaded that, got to know the formatting a little bit more than I do, because I've read lots of screenplays and scripts, but I've not written any myself in that format at least. And just got to work, and I flew through probably about 10 minutes worth of what would be a podcast, a really highly developed podcast, in about 20 minutes. I mean, it just flew out because the format changed. It unlocked something within me. You can do the same thing with writing. If you need help writing, say, I need to write a newsletter paragraph about X, Y, and Z. There are actual tools that you can use like Jasper.ai that you can put the topic and 2 or 3 little things that you want to cover in that, and it will spit out a suggested paragraph for you. And it's amazing how good it is because it's scraped enough of the internet to kind of know the valid points. It's 100% original. You will have to go do some fixes on it and make it more relevant, but it can be enough to get you unstuck. The other thing is, the freaking notes app on your phone. You're at a stoplight and one of these little epiphanies comes to you. You can either write that down or wherever you are in your house. The other thing, I do a ton of voice to text. I'll send myself text messages and say, hey, Perry, or hey, Siri, send a text to Perry. And my phone responds, and I just, dictate a note to myself about, what something a character's doing, a plot idea, or something else. So all of these things that we have, maybe it's just writing pen to paper. There are tons and tons of opportunities that you have just to unlock the creativity simply by changing the format in the tools that you're working with. It's worked for me. I know it's going to work for anybody in here that wants to try that. And then the last thing is, don't be afraid to repeat ourselves. We know, as people engaged in the education space, that learning and content retention degrades over time, and that it takes several times to tell somebody something before they actually retain that thing. So the problem with us in content creator role is we feel like we have to be new and original and unique every single time, when in fact we can just say the same thing multiple ways, multiple times over long periods of time. And you're going to get new audience. You're going to get people pick it up and see it the first time, or you're going to get somebody that sees it newly for the first time, even if they've been exposed to it before. So we can't and shouldn't feel like we're stuck by the things that we've done in the past, and we always have to move past that. We might have to reframe it, might have to change it up a little bit, might have to find a new interesting vector into it or take on it, but we can talk about the same thing a lot because that's what we need whenever we're learning something. So if I were to summarize, here are the 7 different points. Learn from everybody, think about branches, trenches, and pivots, Create artificial constraints for yourself, use other people's stuff and give them credit, admit ignorance and leverage the process of learning and just talk about that. Ruthlessly outsource, and then find tools that help you or force you to think and work in new ways. And then there's a bonus one, which is that don't be afraid to repeat yourself. And so what now? I would say if you're going home tonight, tomorrow, and you want some things to do as soon as possible, sign up for masterclass or something else that's similar, that is going to constantly be feeding you the opportunity to learn something that may be interesting to you or might find an interesting vector into the things that you care about. You want to commit to finding ways to create at least 30 to 60 minutes of quiet every few days so that you can have these little serendipity moments bubble up. Your mind can process and present you new things that you go, oh, that's a good idea. Oh, that's a really weird idea. Never do that. Or this is a bad idea, but or an out of context idea that may be useful somewhere else. Find at least one aspect of your current creative process that you can outsource. And then find your best tool to continually capture those in the moment ideas, whether that's a notes app on your phone, whether that's Google Docs, something that synchronizes in the cloud if you're using non-private information is a good thing because it doesn't matter what your device is. So I can do a note on my phone in Notes or Google Docs, then I can access it on my computer. Then I can also access, I can share that to somebody else or a different device. It just gets to be where you're removing barriers as much as possible and trying to get yourself into a flow state where you're constantly generating ideas, putting them in some kind of form so they're out of your head and you don't forget them. And then you have a chance to revisit those later on. And then look at anything you've created in the past and say, what would I do different now? How would I do that thing different now? If I talked about passwords, how would I approach that same topic this year as opposed to last year to put a new, fresh spin on it or to engage a different audience that maybe I had an unconscious bias against? And that's the other thing that I think if we were to have a realization among ourselves, is that anytime you create a piece of content, anytime I create a piece of content, we are accidentally injecting our own framing biases on that piece of content. And so when you look at it fresh 6 months from now, it can look completely different. You go, oh, you know what? If I actually wanted to capture my marketing department, my PR department, my IT department differently, maybe I need to change these terms. Where did I accidentally put in my own bias, my own preconceptions, have my own blind spots? Or where can I inject new, fresh creativity that wasn't there when I first did it? And that's it for me. Thank you.